The alarm bells pierced through the quiet Tuesday morning at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was reviewing training schedules when the emergency call came through the radio. A massive earthquake had struck the coastal town of Ocean View, just 30 miles south of the base. Buildings had collapsed, roads were blocked, and hundreds of people were trapped under the rubble. Sarah had been a Marine for 8 years, but she had never seen anything like the chaos that awaited her team. As the helicopter flew over Ocean View, she could see the destruction below. The main street looked like a war zone. Cars were crushed under concrete slabs, and smoke rose from several fires throughout the town. The local fire department and police were overwhelmed, and the National Guard wouldn't arrive for another 6 hours. "We're going in first," Sarah told her squad of 12 Marines as they prepared to land. "Our job is to find survivors and get them to safety before the aftershocks hit." The weather was getting worse too. Dark clouds were gathering and the wind was picking up. Rain would make the rescue operations even more dangerous. The helicopter touched down in the town's football field, which had become the temporary command center. Sarah quickly assessed the situation with the local emergency coordinator, Chief Peterson. He was a veteran firefighter with 30 years of experience, but even he looked shaken by what they were facing. "The elementary school took a direct hit," Peterson explained, pointing to a map marked with red zones. "We think there are at least 20 kids trapped in the East Wing. The grocery store on Main Street collapsed during the morning rush. Could be 50 people in there. And the retirement home on Elm Street. We don't even know how many residents were inside when it happened." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Every minute that passed meant lives could be lost. She divided her team into 3 groups, each taking one of the major collapse sites. She would lead the team going to the elementary school, knowing that children's lives hung in the balance. As they made their way through the debris-filled streets, Sarah's team had to climb over twisted metal and broken concrete. The school building was partially standing, but the East Wing had pancaked completely. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was standing outside with tears in her eyes holding a class roster. "The children were in music class when it happened," she sobbed. 22 first and second graders. Their teacher, Miss Kelly, was with them. "We got everyone else out, but that room, it's completely buried." Sarah studied the collapsed section. The roof had come down first, followed by the second floor, creating a sandwich of concrete and steel. But there were small gaps, spaces where someone might survive if they were lucky. She could hear faint sounds coming from within the rubble. "We need cutting equipment," Sarah radioed back to base. "And bring the search dogs. We have signs of life." While they waited for the equipment, Sarah and her Marines began moving smaller pieces of debris by hand. Every rock they moved had to be done carefully. One wrong move could cause more collapse and endanger any survivors trapped below. The rain started falling as the rescue equipment arrived. Sarah's uniform was soon soaked, but she didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on the sounds coming from beneath the concrete. There were definitely voices down there, small voices calling for help. "Miss Kelly! Miss Kelly!" The children's voices were weak but clear enough to give the rescuers hope. Sarah crawled into a narrow gap between 2 concrete slabs following the sound. The space was barely wide enough for her body, and sharp edges of rebar caught at her uniform as she moved deeper into the collapsed structure. "Can you hear me?" Sarah called out. "This is the Marines. We're here to help you. Help us," came the reply. "We're scared." "Miss Kelly is hurt." Sarah used her flashlight to peer deeper into the cavity. About 15 feet ahead, she could see a small air pocket where the children were trapped. She could make out tiny faces looking back at her, eyes wide with fear but filled with hope now that help had arrived. The space was too small for her equipment, so Sarah had to back out and find another way in. She spent the next 2 hours exploring different entry points, each time getting a little closer to the trapped classroom. Her knees were scraped raw from crawling over concrete, and her hands were cut from moving sharp debris, but she kept going. By afternoon, Sarah's team had managed to create a stable tunnel leading to the air pocket. It was dangerous work. Every few minutes, small aftershocks would shake the building, causing everyone to freeze and wait to see if the structure would hold. But Sarah knew that time was running out. The children had been trapped for over 6 hours, and some of them might be injured. "I'm going in," Sarah announced, strapping on her safety line. The tunnel was so narrow that she had to remove her equipment vest to fit through. If something went wrong, she would be trapped along with the children. As she crawled through the tunnel, Sarah could hear the children's voices getting louder. They were singing a song that their teacher had taught them, probably to keep their spirits up and stay calm. When Sarah finally reached the air pocket, she found 21 children huddled together around their teacher, Miss Kelly, who was unconscious but breathing. "Are you really a Marine?" asked a little girl with pigtails, her face dirty but her eyes bright with curiosity. "Yes, I am," Sarah smiled, trying to hide how serious the situation really was. "And I'm here to take you all home to your families." The children cheered softly, but Sarah could see that several of them were hurt. 2 boys had cuts on their arms, and one little girl was holding her wrist in a way that suggested it might be broken. Miss Kelly had a head injury and needed immediate medical attention. Sarah radioed to her team above ground. "I found them. 21 children and 1 adult. We need medical supplies lowered down, and we need to widen this tunnel. Some of them are injured and can't crawl out on their own." The rescue was just beginning, but Sarah had given the children and their families something precious: hope. As she sat in the small air pocket, surrounded by scared but brave children, Sarah knew that getting them all out safely would be the most important mission of her life. The next 3 hours tested every skill Sarah had learned in her Marine training. Working in the cramped air pocket with 21 frightened children and their unconscious teacher required patience, strength, and creativity she didn't know she possessed. The children ranged in age from 6 to 8 years old, and each one needed individual attention and care. Sarah's team above ground worked frantically to widen the tunnel, but progress was slow. Every piece of debris they removed had to be carefully analyzed to make sure removing it wouldn't cause more collapse. Meanwhile, Sarah did her best to keep the children calm and assess their injuries with the limited medical supplies that could be lowered down through the narrow opening. "What's your name?" Sarah asked the little girl with pigtails who had spoken to her first. "Emma," the girl replied. "Is Miss Kelly going to be okay?" "She won't wake up." Sarah checked Miss Kelly's pulse again. It was steady and her breathing was regular, but the head injury was serious. "She's sleeping right now so her body can heal," Sarah explained. "When we get her to the doctors, they'll take good care of her." One by one, Sarah learned the children's names and checked each one for injuries. Tommy had a cut on his forehead that had stopped bleeding. Jessica's wrist was definitely broken. Little Marcus was having trouble breathing, possibly from dust inhalation. But amazingly, most of the children had only minor scrapes and bruises. Their teacher had positioned herself over several of them when the ceiling came down, using her own body as a shield. The rain outside was getting heavier, which meant water was starting to drip into their small space. Sarah realized they needed to move faster. She radioed to her team leader above ground. "How much longer until we can start moving them out?" she asked. "Another hour at least," came the reply. "The tunnel needs to be wider for the injured ones, and we need to shore up the sides so it doesn't collapse during evacuation." Sarah looked around at the children's faces in her flashlight beam. Some were starting to look tired and scared again. She needed to keep their spirits up and their minds off their situation. "Who knows some songs?" she asked. "I bet you know songs that I've never heard before." Soon the small space was filled with the sound of children's voices singing nursery rhymes and songs from their music class. Sarah was amazed by their resilience. Despite being trapped in a dark, cramped space for hours, these kids were still able to laugh and sing. But Sarah was starting to feel the physical strain of the rescue. She had been crawling through tight spaces and working in uncomfortable positions for hours. Her back ached. Her hands were raw from moving concrete, and she was becoming dehydrated. Every time she moved, her muscles protested. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's team above ground finally had the tunnel wide enough to begin evacuations. The plan was to take the most seriously injured first. Miss Kelly would go out on a backboard, followed by Jessica with the broken wrist, then Marcus, who was having breathing difficulties. Getting Miss Kelly out required 4 Marines working in relay. Sarah secured the teacher to the backboard in the cramped space, then guided it through the first section of tunnel to where another Marine took over. It was exhausting work, made harder by the need to move slowly and carefully to avoid causing more injury. Jessica was next. The little girl was brave, but Sarah could see she was in pain. "You're going to see your mom and dad very soon," Sarah promised as she helped Jessica into the tunnel. "Just follow the Marine in front of you and don't worry about anything else." One by one, the children were evacuated. Each evacuation took about 20 minutes, and Sarah had to guide every child through the first section of tunnel. By the time half the children were out, Sarah was fighting exhaustion. Her arms shook from the physical effort, and her throat was raw from breathing dusty air for hours. "Sarah, you need to come out and rest," her team leader radioed. "We can send someone else in to help with the remaining kids." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "These children trust me. I'm not leaving until every one of them is safe." Marcus was having more trouble breathing, so they moved him up in the evacuation order. Sarah had to carry him through part of the tunnel because he was too weak to crawl on his own. Her back screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. When she handed Marcus over to the next Marine in the tunnel, she had to rest for several minutes before going back for the next child. The rescued children were taken to a medical tent that had been set up in the school parking lot. Parents who had been waiting anxiously outside the school zone were finally allowed to see their children. Sarah could hear the sounds of joyful reunions even from deep inside the collapsed building. But her work wasn't finished. There were still 11 children in the air pocket, and they were getting more frightened as their friends left one by one. Sarah had to keep reassuring them that everyone would get out safely. "Am I going to see my mommy?" asked 6-year-old David, tears making tracks through the dirt on his face. "Absolutely," Sarah said, giving him a gentle hug. "Your mommy is waiting for you outside right now. She's been here all day and she can't wait to hold you." As the sun began to set, Sarah guided the last group of children toward the tunnel. Her flashlight was getting dim and she was running on pure determination. Every muscle in her body ached and she was beginning to feel dizzy from dehydration and exhaustion. 8-year-old. Brian was the last child in the air pocket with Sarah. He had been helping her keep the younger children calm throughout the day, showing a maturity beyond his years. "Are you okay, Miss Marine?" Brian asked, noticing that Sarah was moving more slowly. "I'm fine," Sarah smiled, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. "Let's get you out of here so you can see your family." As Brian disappeared into the tunnel ahead of her, Sarah took one last look around the small space that had been their world for the past 8 hours. Tomorrow this would just be a pile of rubble waiting to be cleared away. But today, it had been the place where 21 children and their teacher had survived the impossible, and where Sarah had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she had. Now she just had to make it out herself. Sarah began her crawl through the tunnel, but her body was no longer responding the way it had hours earlier. Every movement required enormous effort, and her vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and dehydration. The tunnel that had seemed manageable when she was focused on the children now felt endless and claustrophobic. Halfway through the first section, Sarah had to stop. Her arms were shaking so badly she couldn't support her weight anymore. She tried to radio her team, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The dust and debris had taken their toll on her throat and lungs. "Sarah, what's your status?" came the voice through her radio. She tried to respond but started coughing instead. The coughing fit lasted several minutes and left her even weaker than before. Sarah realized with growing concern that she might not be able to make it out on her own. Above ground, her team leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, noticed that Sarah hadn't emerged from the tunnel yet. It had been 40 minutes since the last child came out, and Sarah should have been right behind him. "Martinez, report your position," Rodriguez called into his radio. When there was no response, he made a quick decision. "I'm going in after her," he announced to the team. "She's been down there for over 9 hours. Her body's probably at its limit." Rodriguez entered the tunnel system, moving as quickly as the narrow space would allow. He found Sarah about 20 feet from the air pocket, lying on her side and struggling to breathe. Her face was pale and she was barely conscious. "Hey, Sarah, stay with me," Rodriguez said, checking her pulse. It was rapid and weak. "We're getting you out of here." But getting an unconscious person through the tunnel was far more difficult than guiding frightened but mobile children. Rodriguez had to half carry, half drag Sarah through sections that were barely wide enough for one person. It took him nearly an hour to get her to a wider section where other team members could help. By the time they got Sarah to the surface, word of the rescue had spread throughout the base and the local community. The school parking lot was filled not just with the families of the rescued children, but with news crews, other military personnel, and townspeople who had come to help however they could. Sarah was immediately taken to the medical tent, where Navy corpsmen worked to stabilize her condition. She was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from what medics call acute stress reaction. Her body had pushed beyond its normal limits and now it was shutting down to protect itself. While Sarah received medical attention, The full scope of what she had accomplished was becoming clear. In addition to the 21 children and their teacher from the elementary school, Sarah's overall rescue operation had saved a total of 63 people from 3 different collapse sites. Her quick thinking and leadership had coordinated multiple rescue teams and prevented what could have been a much larger tragedy. The children she had rescued were recovering well. Miss Kelly had regained consciousness and, despite a concussion, was expected to make a full recovery. Jessica's broken wrist was set in a cast, and Marcus's breathing had improved significantly once he received proper medical care. Most importantly, all of the children were alive and would go home to their families. But Sarah remained unconscious in the medical tent. The corpsman had set up IV fluids to help with her dehydration, but her body needed time to recover from the extreme physical and emotional stress of the day. Her commanding officer, Colonel Williams, stood vigil beside her cot, along with several of her fellow Marines who had driven down from the base as soon as they heard what had happened. News of Sarah's heroic rescue began spreading beyond the local area. Social media posts from grateful parents shared photos of their children safely at home, crediting the brave Marine who had risked her life to save them. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon national networks were reporting on the earthquake rescue and the Marine who had collapsed from exhaustion after saving dozens of lives. But Sarah was unaware of any of this attention. She drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the night, her body slowly beginning to recover its strength. The medical team monitoring her vital signs reported steady improvement, but they wanted to keep her under observation for at least 24 hours. The next morning, as news of the rescue continued to spread, something remarkable began happening at the base. Marines from Sarah's unit started requesting permission to visit the disaster site. They wanted to check on their fellow Marine and see if there was anything more they could do to help with the ongoing recovery efforts. Colonel Williams initially planned to allow only a small group to visit, but as word spread throughout the base, more and more Marines expressed their desire to show support for Sarah and the rescue efforts. Soon it became clear that this was more than just concern for a fellow Marine. It was recognition of something truly extraordinary. "She embodies everything we stand for," said Staff Sergeant Johnson, who had served with Sarah for 3 years. "Courage, determination, putting others before yourself. What she did yesterday. That's what being a Marine is all about." By afternoon, Colonel Williams had organized an official visit to the disaster site. More than 200 Marines from Camp Pendleton would make the trip to Ocean View, not just to support Sarah, but to help with ongoing recovery efforts and to show the community that the Marine Corps stood with them in their time of need. The Marines who had worked directly with Sarah during the rescue were already telling stories that would become legend within the Corps. They talked about her calm leadership under pressure, her refusal to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless, and her absolute commitment to saving every single child trapped in that school. "I've been a Marine for 15 years, said Gunnery Sergeant Peterson, who had led one of the other rescue teams. "I've seen combat, I've seen natural disasters, I've seen Marines do incredible things. But what Lieutenant Martinez did yesterday, I've never seen anything like it. She didn't just save those kids' lives. She showed all of us what true courage looks like." As evening approached on the second day, Sarah finally began to show signs of returning to full consciousness. Her vital signs had stabilized and the color was returning to her face. The medical team was optimistic that she would make a complete recovery, though they insisted she needed several more days of rest. But Sarah's first words when she fully woke up weren't about her own condition. "The children," she whispered to the corpsman checking her IV. "Are all the children safe?" "Every single one," he assured her with a smile. "They're all home with their families thanks to you." Sarah closed her eyes again, finally allowing herself to rest, knowing that her mission had been successful. She had no idea that outside the medical tent, preparations were underway for something that would surprise her more than anything that had happened during the rescue itself. On the third morning after the rescue, Sarah woke up feeling stronger than she had since the earthquake. The medical team had cleared her to sit up and take short walks around the tent, though they insisted she needed at least 2 more days of rest before returning to duty. She was grateful to be feeling better, but she was also eager to get back to normal life and put the intensity of the rescue behind her. What Sarah didn't know is that her story had captured the attention of people far beyond Ocean View and Camp Pendleton. Videos taken by parents and news crews during the rescue had gone viral on social media. The image of Sarah emerging from the collapsed school building, covered in dust and debris, carrying little Marcus in her arms, had been shared millions of times with captions calling her a real-life hero and what courage looks like. The story had reached Washington, D.C., where Pentagon officials were taking notice. It had reached Hollywood, where several production companies were already discussing movie rights. Most importantly for what was about to happen, it had reached Marines stationed around the world who were sharing the story with pride and making plans to honor one of their own. Colonel Williams had been fielding phone calls all morning from Marine bases across the country, units from Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Quantico in Virginia, and even Marines deployed overseas were asking how they could show their support for Sarah and participate in recognizing her heroism. "Sir, I've never seen anything like this response," said his aide, Captain Morrison. "We've got Marine units requesting permission to send representatives here. The Commandant's office has called 3 times, and we've got over 500 civilian requests to attend whatever ceremony we're planning." But Colonel Williams had decided that any ceremony should wait until Sarah was fully recovered and back on her feet. What he didn't anticipate was that the Marines wouldn't wait for an official ceremony to show their respect. It started with Sarah's own unit. Word spread through the barracks that she would be taking her first real walk outside the medical tent that afternoon. Without any official organization or permission, Marines began gathering near the tent. At first it was just a few of her closest friends and colleagues, but the group grew larger as the afternoon progressed. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had pulled Sarah from the tunnel, organized what he called an informal welcome back. He and several other Marines who had participated in the rescue wanted to be there when Sarah emerged, just to show their support and let her know how proud they were of her. But news of the gathering spread through social media and local networks. The families of the children Sarah had rescued heard about it and asked if they could attend. Local residents who had been helped during the earthquake recovery wanted to show their gratitude. Before long, what had started as a small gathering of Marines had grown into something much larger. By mid-afternoon, more than 1,000 people had gathered in the field outside the medical tent. There were Marines in dress uniforms who had driven from other bases. There were the families of all 21 children Sarah had rescued, many carrying signs with messages of thanks. There were townspeople who had come to show their appreciation to the Marine who had helped save their community. Sarah was completely unaware of what was happening outside. She was resting in the tent, reading get well cards that had been sent by children from schools across the country. The cards were filled with drawings of Marines and American flags, with messages like "Thank you for saving the kids" and "You are my hero." Colonel Williams approached the tent as Sarah was looking through the cards. "How are you feeling, Lieutenant?" he asked. "Much better, sir," Sarah replied, starting to stand at attention. "At ease," the colonel said with a smile. "I think you've earned the right to stay comfortable. Are you feeling up to a short walk outside? The doctors say fresh air would be good for you." Sarah nodded, grateful for the chance to get out of the tent. She had been cooped up for 3 days and was eager to see the sun and breathe clean air. She put on her utility uniform and followed the colonel toward the tent entrance. "Sir, it sounds like there are a lot of people outside," Sarah observed, hearing the murmur of many voices beyond the tent walls. "Yes," Colonel Williams replied, pausing at the tent flap. "Lieutenant Martinez, I want you to know that what you did during the earthquake has made every Marine proud. Your actions exemplified the very best of our Corps' values. What you're about to see outside is a spontaneous demonstration of respect and gratitude from your fellow Marines and the community you helped save." Sarah wasn't sure what to expect as the colonel opened the tent flap, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Stretching across the entire field were hundreds of Marines standing at attention in perfect formation. Behind them were the families she had helped, many holding American flags and homemade signs. The entire gathering was silent, showing a level of respect usually reserved for the most formal military ceremonies. But what took Sarah's breath away was the sight at the front of the formation. The 21 children she had rescued from the school were standing in a line, each one wearing a small American flag pin and holding a single white flower. Miss Kelly stood behind them, still wearing a bandage on her head but smiling broadly. As Sarah stepped fully out of the tent, a single voice called out, "Attention!" and every Marine in the field snapped to their most perfect salute. The hundreds of civilians behind them placed their hands over their hearts. The only sounds were the flags flapping in the breeze and a few quiet sobs from grateful parents. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight before her. She had expected maybe a few of her unit members to greet her, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Slowly she returned the salute, her own eyes filling with tears as she looked across the sea of people who had come to honor her. Little Emma, the girl with pigtails who had first spoken to Sarah in the collapsed school, stepped forward from the line of children. In her small voice, she called out, "Thank you for saving us, Miss Marine." That broke the formal silence, and the entire gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Parents rushed forward with their children to hug Sarah and thank her personally. Marines from other units approached to shake her hand and tell her how proud they were to serve in the same corps. For the next 2 hours, Sarah was surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her actions. She met Marines who had driven from bases hundreds of miles away just to show their respect. She hugged parents who credited her with giving them back their children. She listened to stories from townspeople about how the rescue had inspired them and given them hope during their community's darkest hour. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran with 20 years in the Corps, approached her with tears in his eyes. "Lieutenant," he said, "I've served in 3 wars and seen Marines do incredible things. But what you did, you reminded all of us why we wear this uniform. You made every Marine proud to be called your brother or sister." As the sun began to set and the gathering slowly dispersed, Sarah realized that her life had been changed forever. She had simply done what her training and her heart told her was right, but somehow that had touched something deeper in people. She had become a symbol of what was best about the Marine Corps and about the human spirit when faced with crisis. Standing in that field, surrounded by flags and fellow Marines, Sarah understood that she would carry this responsibility for the rest of her life, and she was ready for it. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes to Sarah's life that she never could have anticipated. The Marine Corps had recommended her for the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the highest non-combat decoration for heroism. News media from around the world wanted to interview her. Publishers were calling about book deals, and Hollywood agents were discussing movie rights to her story. But Sarah found herself struggling with all the attention. She had joined the Marines to serve others, not to become famous. The constant interviews and public appearances felt overwhelming, especially when she was still recovering physically and emotionally from the trauma of the rescue operation. "I just did my job," Sarah repeatedly told reporters who asked her to describe her feelings about being called a hero. Any Marine would have done the same thing in that situation. The real heroes are the children who stayed brave during those hours underground, and their teacher who protected them with her own body. Despite her reluctance to embrace the spotlight, Sarah began to understand that her story was having a positive impact beyond just the people she had directly saved. Letters poured in from young people around the country, saying that her example had inspired them to consider military service or careers in emergency response. Parents wrote to thank her for giving them a role model to point to when teaching their children about courage and selflessness. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from a teenage girl in Ohio whose family had been struggling with financial problems and personal difficulties. "Dear Lieutenant Martinez," the letter read, "I saw your story on the news and it changed something in my heart. I was thinking about giving up on my dreams because everything seemed too hard. But when I saw what you did for those children, even when you were exhausted and scared, I realized that real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. I'm not giving up anymore. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Letters like this helped Sarah understand that her reluctance to accept recognition might actually be selfish. If her story could inspire others to find courage in their own lives, then perhaps she had a responsibility to share it, even when doing so made her uncomfortable. 3 months after the rescue, Sarah received news that the Marine Corps wanted to use her story as part of their recruitment and training programs. They asked her to speak at Marine Corps recruit depots and to work with drill instructors to help new Marines understand the values and character that the Corps sought to develop. Sarah's first speaking engagement was at Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego, where she addressed a graduating class of new Marines. As she looked out at the young men and women who had just completed their transformation from civilians to Marines, Sarah saw her younger self and remembered her own graduation day 8 years earlier. "When I crawled into that collapsed school building," Sarah told the new Marines, "I wasn't thinking about being heroic or brave. I was thinking about 21 children who needed help, and I was the person in the best position to help them." Everything you've learned here in the past 13 weeks has prepared you to be that person when your community needs you most. Sarah went on to explain that the physical training, the discipline, and the emphasis on teamwork that the recruits had endured weren't just about making them better soldiers. They were about building the character and resilience that would allow them to serve others when the stakes were highest. "The children I rescued that day are alive because of every Marine who ever trained me, every drill instructor who pushed me beyond what I thought were my limits, and every fellow Marine who had my back during missions," she continued. "You are now part of that tradition. Someday someone's life may depend on the strength and courage you've developed here." After her speech, Sarah spent time talking individually with some of the new Marines. Many of them shared their own reasons for joining the Corps, and Sarah was struck by the variety of backgrounds and motivations represented in just one graduating class. There was Maria, whose family had immigrated from Guatemala, and who wanted to serve the country that had given them a new life. There was James, who had grown up in foster care and was looking for the sense of family and belonging that the Marine Corps provided. There was Ashley, who had overcome addiction and saw military service as a way to rebuild her life and help others. Each of these young Marines reminded Sarah that heroism wasn't something reserved for dramatic rescue operations. It was found in the daily decision to serve something larger than yourself, to push through discomfort and fear to help others, and to live according to principles even when no one was watching. As Sarah's role as a spokesperson and trainer developed, she also continued her regular duties as a Marine officer. She was promoted to captain and given command of a training unit at Camp Pendleton. Her experiences during the earthquake rescue had given her insights into leadership, under pressure that proved valuable in preparing other Marines for their own challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Sarah's new role was the relationships she maintained with the people whose lives had been changed by the rescue. The families of the children she had saved became like extended family to her. She attended birthday parties, school graduations, and holiday celebrations. She watched the children grow and develop, knowing that she had played a small part in making their futures possible. Miss Kelly, the teacher who had been injured while protecting her students, became a particularly close friend. She had returned to teaching after her recovery, and often invited Sarah to speak to her classes about courage, service, and making a difference in the world. "You gave me back my students," Miss Kelly told Sarah during one of these visits. "But more than that, you showed them that there are people in the world who will risk everything to keep them safe. That's a lesson that will stay with them for the rest of their lives." Little Emma, now 2 years older and missing her front teeth, had maintained a pen pal relationship with Sarah. Her letters were filled with updates about school, friends, and family, but she always ended them the same way. "Thank you for saving us. Captain Sarah, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do." These connections with the people she had helped kept Sarah grounded as her public profile continued to grow. Awards ceremonies and media appearances were gratifying, but the real reward was knowing that her actions had allowed 21 children to continue growing, learning, and contributing to the world. As Sarah reflected on the path that had led her from that collapsed school building to her current role as a leader and inspiration for others, she realized that the rescue operation had been just the beginning of her real mission. Saving those children had been important, but helping others find their own courage and commitment to service might ultimately have an even greater impact. Standing before a new group of Marine recruits as they prepared for graduation, Sarah understood that her story was no longer just about one dramatic day. It had become about showing others that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were properly prepared and motivated by love for others. And that was a mission she was proud to embrace for the rest of her career and beyond. 5 years after the earthquake rescue that changed her life, Captain Sarah Martinez stood before the largest gathering of Marines she had ever addressed. The occasion was the annual Marine Corps Birthday Ball, and she had been chosen to deliver the keynote speech to Marines from bases across the western United States. As she looked out at the sea of dress blue uniforms, Sarah reflected on how far she had traveled from that dusty day in the collapsed school building. The years since the Rescue had been filled with opportunities and responsibilities that Sarah had never imagined when she first enlisted. She had spoken to hundreds of groups of Marines, civilians, and school children. She had testified before Congress about emergency preparedness and the role of the military in disaster response. She had been featured in documentaries and had written a book about leadership and service that had become required reading at several military academies. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't speaking as the hero of a rescue operation or as a symbol of Marine Corps values. Tonight she was speaking as a Marine who had learned that true heroism wasn't found in single moments of courage, but in a lifetime commitment to serving others and inspiring them to find their own strength. "Fellow Marines," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom filled with 800 Marines and their families. "5 years ago, I spent 9 hours in a collapsed building with 21 children and their teacher. When people call me a hero for that day, I always tell them that heroes aren't made in moments of crisis. Heroes are made in the years of preparation that come before those moments, and in the years of service that come after." Sarah went on to share stories from her recent travels around the country. Speaking to young people about service and leadership, she told about visiting inner-city schools where students faced challenges that made her own struggles seem small. She described meeting veterans who were using their military experience to serve their communities in new ways. She talked about the Marine reservists who balanced civilian careers with their commitment to be ready for any crisis. "Every one of you in this room tonight is a hero in someone's life," Sarah continued. "You might be the parent who works 2 jobs to support your family while still training with your unit on weekends. You might be the Marine who volunteers at the homeless shelter on your days off. You might be the drill instructor who sees potential in a struggling recruit and refuses to give up on them." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Sarah could see in their faces the recognition of their own stories and their own quiet acts of heroism that rarely made headlines. One of the most powerful parts of Sarah's speech came when she talked about the children she had rescued and how they had grown in the years since the earthquake. Emma, the little girl with pigtails who had first spoken to Sarah in the collapsed building, was now 13 years old and had just been accepted into a specialized program for students interested in emergency medicine. She credited her interest in helping others to the example Sarah had set during the rescue. Marcus, the boy who had breathing difficulties during the rescue, had become a competitive swimmer and was using his platform as an athlete to raise money for disaster relief organizations. Jessica, whose wrist had been broken in the collapse, had learned to play piano with her cast on and now performed at charity events for first responder families. "These children are living proof that heroism is contagious," Sarah told the assembled Marines. "When we act with courage and selflessness, we plant seeds that can grow in ways we never anticipate. Every day, each of you has the opportunity to plant those seeds in the lives of the people around you." But Sarah's most important message that night was about the future of service. She spoke about the challenges facing the country and the world, from natural disasters to social problems to international conflicts. She emphasized that the Marine Corps would continue to play a vital role not just in combat operations, but in building stronger communities and inspiring citizens to care for one another. "The earthquake that brought me to that collapsed school was a tragedy that could have been much worse," Sarah explained. "But it also became an opportunity for our community to see what was possible when people were willing to sacrifice for others. Every crisis we face as a nation is also an opportunity to show the world what America stands for." After her speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of Marines who wanted to share their own stories of service and their plans for the future. She met a young sergeant who was studying to become a teacher when he left the Marines. Inspired by the story of Miss Kelly's courage in protecting her students, she talked with a corporal who had organized a mentorship program for at-risk youth in his hometown. She listened to a staff sergeant who was developing new training programs to help Marines transition to civilian careers in emergency services. Each conversation reinforced Sarah's belief that the most important impact of her rescue story wasn't the recognition it had brought her, but the way it had inspired others to find their own ways to serve. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the same ocean she had flown over 5 years ago on her way to the earthquake zone, nervous about what they would find but determined to help however she could. Now she understood that the rescue operation had been just the beginning of a much larger mission. Colonel Williams, now promoted to general, joined her on the balcony. He had become not just her commanding officer, but a mentor and friend who had helped guide her through the challenges of unexpected fame and responsibility. "You know," General Williams said, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off the water, "when I first met you, I saw a good Marine with potential. I had no idea I was meeting someone who would change the way people think about service and heroism." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by the events of that day 5 years ago. The children who were now teenagers with bright futures ahead of them. The Marines who had been inspired to new levels of commitment and service. The civilians who had been motivated to get involved in their communities. "I think the earthquake changed all of us," Sarah replied. "It reminded us that we're all connected, and that we all have the ability to help each other when times get tough. The Marine Corps taught me the skills I needed for that day, but that day taught me what I wanted to do with the rest of my life." As they stood in comfortable silence, Sarah thought about the future. She had recently been selected for promotion to major and was being considered for command of a training regiment. She was also working on plans for a non-profit organization that would provide disaster preparedness training to schools and communities. But whatever roles and responsibilities lay ahead, Sarah knew that her mission would remain the same: to serve others and to inspire them to find their own courage and compassion. The little girl with pigtails who had asked if she was really a Marine had grown into a teenager who wanted to become a doctor. The boy who had trouble breathing had become an athlete who raised money for disaster victims. The teacher who had protected her students with her own body had returned to the classroom with an even deeper commitment to nurturing young minds. These were the true measures of success, Sarah realized. Not the medals or the recognition, but the ripple effect of courage spreading through communities and inspiring new generations of heroes. As she headed back inside to rejoin the celebration, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that heroism wasn't something that happened once and was over. It was a choice that had to be made new each day, in big ways and small ways, by ordinary people who decided to put others before themselves. The rescue operation that had nearly cost Sarah her life had given her something far more valuable in return: a clear understanding of her purpose and the opportunity to help others discover their own capacity for greatness. And that was a mission she would carry forward for the rest of her life, one person and one community at a time.